Today, I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough credit: consistency. We often think motivation is what gets results, but motivation is fleeting. It comes and goes like the weather. If you rely on it, you'll only act when you feel good, and that's not enough. If you want to build anything meaningful, strength, discipline, skill, or purpose, you have to force yourself to be consistent, not when it's convenient, not when you feel like it every single day. It's not glamorous, it's not loud, it's not exciting, but consistency is the reason some people rise while others remain stagnant. And let's be clear, forcing yourself to be consistent doesn't mean burnout. It means setting non-negotiable habits that you do whether you're tired, stressed, or uninspired. You train your brain to show up no matter what. Why? Because the brain thrives on repetition. Every time you repeat an action, you're reinforcing neural circuits. You're telling your nervous system, this matters, lock this in. The people you admire, they don't rely on willpower. They've built systems. They've trained their biology to show up even on their worst days. So today, make this a principle: discipline over motivation, process over emotion, repetition over perfection. When you repeat a behavior over and over, you're not just forming a habit, you're literally reshaping your brain. The neurons involved in that action begin firing together more efficiently. This process is called long-term potentiation, and it's one of the core mechanisms behind learning and memory. Each repetition increases the strength of the synaptic connections between those neurons. In simpler terms, the more you do something, the easier it becomes, not just psychologically, but biologically. What's powerful about this is that the brain doesn't make a judgment about whether the behavior is good or bad, productive or unproductive. It just reinforces what you repeat. If you repeatedly avoid hard tasks, those avoidance pathways get stronger. If you consistently face discomfort, whether it's cold exposure, writing, training, or having tough conversations, those circuits become dominant. Over time, the behavior that once felt effortful becomes automatic, even reflexive. This is why consistency isn't just about discipline or mindset. It's about using the brain's plasticity to your advantage. You're literally carving grooves in your nervous system every time you show up. The deeper those grooves get, the more naturally the behavior flows. That's how you stop relying on willpower and start relying on biology. When you engage in a behavior consistently, especially at the same time or in the same context, you're doing more than creating a routine. You're reducing the brain's decision-making burden. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive function like planning, focus, and inhibition, has a limited capacity. Every time you need to decide whether or not to do something, like whether to go to the gym or start your work, you're using precious cognitive resources. But when a behavior becomes consistent, it shifts out of the prefrontal cortex and begins to be encoded in deeper, more automatic parts of the brain, like the basal ganglia. This transition reduces the mental activation energy required to initiate the behavior. In practical terms, it means less inner conflict, less hesitation, and more fluid execution. Consistency offloads the demand for active decision-making. You're no longer asking yourself, should I do this? You just do it. That saves cognitive energy that can be used for deeper work, creative thinking, or navigating unexpected challenges throughout the day. It's one of the most efficient ways to conserve mental bandwidth, especially in high-demand environments. So if you feel overwhelmed or mentally scattered, the solution isn't always to push harder. It's often to automate more, build repeatable patterns, wake up at the same time, anchor certain actions to cues in your environment, and remove friction. Over time, your brain treats these behaviors as default modes, reducing decision fatigue and freeing up your system to focus on what actually requires conscious effort. Dopamine is often misunderstood. People think it's just the pleasure chemical or something that gets released when you achieve a goal. That's only part of the picture. What dopamine really does is drive motivation. It's the neuromodulator that signals anticipation and progress. It's not just about the reward at the end, it's deeply tied to the pursuit itself. This is a crucial distinction when it comes to consistency. The brain releases dopamine in response to novelty and effort toward meaningful goals. When you take a step forward, even a small one, dopamine is released not because you've arrived, but because you're moving in the right direction. And this matters because if you learn to associate dopamine with the process, waking up early, showing up at the gym, putting in the work, your brain starts craving the act of consistency itself. You stop relying on the outcome to feel good. You begin to find satisfaction in the doing. The beauty of this is that it's a trainable system. You can condition your brain to reward effort, not just results. But it takes a shift in focus. Instead of saying, I'll feel good once I've achieved X, you reinforce an I feel good because I'm doing what I said I'd do. That creates a feedback loop. Each time you complete a task you committed to, even something small, you get a dopamine hit that strengthens your motivation to stay on track. The more you stack those, the more momentum you build neurologically. This is also why tracking habits using checklists or journaling progress can be so effective. When you visually mark progress, you're giving your brain evidence of forward movement. That activates the dopaminergic system. Your brain goes, "We're progressing, keep going." And because dopamine pathways are plastic, meaning they adapt and rewire based on experience, this type of reinforcement actually increases your baseline level of motivation over time. Now, the reverse is also true. If you only reward yourself when you hit big milestones, when you get the promotion, finish the book, hit the target weight, you risk long stretches of low dopamine. The brain doesn't register value in a behavior that offers no reinforcement for days, weeks, or months. That's when procrastination, burnout, or distraction sets in. But when you reward effort, you create sustainability. You build what's known as intonic dopamine, a steady state signal that supports endurance and focus. So consistency isn't just a mindset, it's a chemical process. By aligning your behaviors with the brain's reward system, you learn to crave the repetition, not just the result. You transform repetition from something that feels boring or forced into something that feels internally motivating because your brain is literally signaling, "This is working, do more of it." The human brain and body are wired to operate on roughly 24-hour cycles known as circadian rhythms. These rhythms aren't just about sleep. They influence nearly every aspect of physiology: hormone release, body temperature, alertness, focus, physical performance, and even mood. When your daily actions align with these natural biological rhythms, you're not just working with time, you're working with your biology. Every morning, shortly after waking and especially after exposure to natural light, the brain increases levels of cortisol and dopamine. These aren't just stress or unpleasure chemicals. They are key drivers of energy, focus, and goal-directed behavior. That morning rise in cortisol is meant to promote alertness and prime the brain for productivity. But if you delay key tasks until later in the day, or live in a state of erratic scheduling, waking at different times, eating inconsistently, training at random, you create misalignment. Your body may be ready for action, but your behavior is out of sync. Over time, this desynchrony leads to problems: reduced energy, poor sleep, low motivation, and metabolic dysfunction. What most people don't realize is that these symptoms often aren't about a lack of effort, they're about a lack of rhythm. When you consistently perform the same actions at the same time each day, whether it's training, focus work, or eating, you reinforce and strengthen those circadian signals. The brain begins to anticipate the effort. Hormonal cascades and neurotransmitter release start adjusting to support those patterns. For example, if you always do deep work between 9 a.m. and noon, the brain begins to elevate norepinephrine and acetylcholine during that window, enhancing focus and cognitive performance. You're no longer forcing your brain to get into the zone. You're teaching it when to be in the zone. This is also true for physical performance. The body is most physically capable in the late afternoon to early evening, around 4 to 6 p.m., because of increased core body temperature, improved reaction time, and muscle elasticity. If you always train at that time, your neuromuscular system adapts. Strength gains, coordination, and endurance all improve faster because your training is aligned with peak physiological readiness. You're not guessing when to push, you're cooperating with biology. One of the most powerful entrainment tools is light. Light entering the eyes early in the day, especially within the first 30 to 60 minutes of waking, anchors your circadian rhythm. This early light exposure suppresses melatonin and sets a timer for its release later that night, helping you fall asleep more easily and stay asleep longer. If your light exposure is inconsistent, your sleep-wake cycle becomes unstable, and everything downstream, focus, mood, immune function, even gut health, can deteriorate. Daily action, therefore, isn't just about repetition. It's about anchoring your nervous system through predictable timing and inputs. Feeding schedules matter too. Eating at roughly the same times each day reinforces signals to the body about when to be alert and when to rest. Random eating windows, especially late at night, can confuse the liver, pancreas, and gut microbiome, all of which are under circadian control. When eating and sleeping are misaligned, the metabolic cost shows up in the form of poor digestion, insulin resistance, and lower energy levels. Consistency in behavior isn't about being robotic. It's about being rhythmic. Just as a drummer locks into the tempo of a song, your brain and body respond best when they can anticipate the beat of your life. Wake up, move, work, eat, train, wind down. All according to a predictable pattern. The more you repeat that rhythm, the stronger the internal clock becomes, and the more energy you free up to actually engage in the work, rather than fighting against your own biology. What looks like discipline from the outside is often just synchronization on the inside. You're not forcing motivation. You're aligning behavior with your innate physiological drive, and when that alignment happens, consistency becomes easier, because your body starts doing the work for you. The environments we occupy, both physical and social, are not neutral. They are sensory landscapes that constantly shape, cue, and reinforce behavior at a neurobiological level. Most people think of behavior as a product of willpower or mindset, but in reality, a large portion of what we do day to day is simply a response to the structure of our surroundings. The brain evolved to conserve energy, to minimize friction, and to follow paths of least resistance. It is exquisitely sensitive to cues in the environment, and those cues, whether visual, auditory, spatial, or even social, play a powerful role in dictating what behaviors are initiated, sustained, or abandoned. From a neural standpoint, behavior is driven by interaction between the prefrontal cortex, which governs decision-making and executive function, and subcortical systems like the basal ganglia and limbic structures, which govern habit formation and emotional reactivity. What's important to understand is that the prefrontal cortex has limited capacity. It's a high-effort system. When you ask it to override your habits or resist temptation constantly, it gets fatigued quickly. That's why relying purely on discipline fails over time. The smarter approach is to modify the environment in ways that offload the burden of decision-making from the prefrontal cortex and instead leverage the automaticity of the brain's habit systems. For example, when you place your phone out of sight during focused work, you're reducing one of the most potent sources of visual and cognitive distraction. That one change reduces the number of decisions you have to make about whether to check notifications or scroll social media. Over time, this trains your attentional circuits to stay engaged with the task at hand. Conversely, leaving your phone face up next to you increases cognitive load. Even if you're not using it, the brain remains partially engaged with the possibility of checking it, which taxes your focus and reduces working memory. Likewise, the configuration of your workspace sends continuous signals to the brain. A cluttered, chaotic environment increases background noise in the form of sensory input, which elevates stress levels and fragments attention. On a physiological level, the brain responds to clutter by increasing cortisol levels, which may elevate anxiety and reduce cognitive control. In contrast, a minimal, organized space reduces the number of stimuli competing for neural resources, allowing you to enter deeper states of concentration more easily. This isn't just a matter of preference. It's a biological optimization of attention through environmental design. Time of day and light exposure are also environmental variables with massive impact. Bright overhead light in the morning helps trigger the brain's alertness circuits via specialized cells in the retina that signal to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the central clock of the brain. This light cue regulates cortisol release and primes the body for movement, focus, and metabolism. If you work in dim lighting or delay exposure to natural light, your circadian rhythm drifts and your cognitive and emotional systems become desynchronized. This leads to brain fog, mood instability, and a general drop in performance. Temperature, sound, and even sense can be engineered to support or sabotage your goals. Cool environments tend to increase alertness and vigilance, while overly warm rooms induce drowsiness. Background noise like ambient music or white noise can sometimes improve focus, but it depends on the task and individual differences in auditory processing. The key is understanding that your sensory inputs are not just passive experiences, they actively modulate the state of your nervous system, either facilitating or impairing your ability to remain consistent with your goals. Social environment is another profound influence. Humans are deeply social organisms, and we're constantly monitoring the behavior of others through mirror neurons and other social circuitry in the brain. When you surround yourself with people who reinforce the behaviors you want to build, whether that's exercising regularly, working hard, or taking care of mental health, you increase your chances of success through a phenomenon known as social contagion. Your brain starts mirroring their actions, adjusting its expectations of what's normal, and reinforcing your own behavioral patterns accordingly. In contrast, if you spend time in an environment where people are disengaged, negative, or undisciplined, your nervous system will begin to adapt to that standard, even if your conscious mind resists it. This is not weakness, this is biology. The human brain is designed to synchronize with its environment. The only question is, are you choosing that environment or is it choosing for you? The beauty of this understanding is that it puts the power back in your hands. You don't need to have superhuman discipline. You need to become a designer of conditions. Build environments that make the right behaviors easier and the wrong behaviors harder. Prepare your space in advance, remove friction, add visual cues that remind you of your goals. Make temptation inconvenient and desired actions obvious. These small environmental adjustments compound over time, creating a system that supports consistency effortlessly. So if you've been struggling to be consistent, don't just look inward, look outward. Your brain is always responding to context. Modify the context and the behavior will follow. The human visual system is the most dominant of all our sensory systems. It consumes a significant portion of the brain's real estate, particularly in the occipital lobe and connected cortical regions. Because of this, what we see in our environment plays a disproportionately powerful role in guiding our behavior, often without conscious awareness. Visual cues are not simply background information. They act as triggers that activate specific neural circuits tied to memory, emotion, and action. This is why integrating intentional visual cues into your environment can significantly improve habit formation and behavioral consistency. When you encounter a visual cue that's been associated with a behavior, like a yoga mat on the floor, a book on your desk, or a water bottle by your keyboard, it activates memory traces in the hippocampus and behavioral scripts stored in the basal ganglia. These brain areas work together to initiate the behavior that has previously been paired with that object or setting. In neuroscience, this is referred to as context-dependent memory retrieval. Your brain doesn't just recall what to do, it retrieves how to do it, when to do it, and why it matters, all triggered by that cue. Visual cues reduce what's called at friction, the mental resistance or activation energy needed to begin a task. For example, if you have a goal to stretch every morning but your mat is tucked away in a closet, you are placing a barrier between intention and action. You might tell yourself you'll do it later or forget altogether. But if that mat is placed right where you normally step in the morning, you're creating a cue that's nearly impossible to ignore. The brain recognizes it, maps it to the intended behavior, and initiates the sequence automatically. This automation is critical because it shifts control from the prefrontal cortex, which is effortful and prone to fatigue, to more automatic systems. Over time, those behaviors require less deliberation. What was once a decision becomes a reflex. You're not thinking about whether to do it, you just do it. There's also a direct link between visual perception and the dopaminergic system. Visual novelty and contrast capture attention by increasing dopamine release in the brain, particularly in areas associated with salience and motivation. When visual cues are emotionally or cognitively associated with a goal, they become motivational anchors. A whiteboard with your goals written on it, placed in a high-traffic area of your home, isn't just a reminder, it's a dopaminergic enhancer. Each time you see it, your brain re-engages with the idea of progress, and that slight increase in dopamine can tip you toward taking action. This is why vision boards, habit trackers, and visual streaks like calendars with check marks or digital apps with progress bars are so effective. They externalize internal goals and give your brain constant low-effort reminders of what matters. Every glance is a microdose of direction and reinforcement. In essence, you're embedding your intentions into your sensory environment, which means your brain is continuously interfacing with those intentions, even when you're not consciously thinking about them. Visual cues also play a critical role in managing behavior variability across different states, such as fatigue, stress, or low motivation. When you're tired, your executive function is compromised. Your ability to make deliberate decisions goes down. But if you've preloaded your environment with visual instructions, like laying out your workout clothes the night before, keeping your journal open on your desk, or setting your guitar in the middle of the room, you bypass the need for high cognitive engagement. The cue does the work. It's as if you're outsourcing motivation to your environment. This isn't just theoretical. It's grounded in the science of cue-response relationships, neuroplasticity, and behavioral reinforcement. The more you pair a cue with a behavior, the stronger the association becomes. And because visual processing is so deeply hardwired into attention and memory systems, these pairings happen quickly and stick more reliably than other types of sensory input. What's equally important is removing or altering visual cues that anchor undesired behaviors. For example, if you're trying to break the habit of doom scrolling late at night, don't just rely on willpower. Change the visual landscape. Remove the phone from the bedroom, place a book by your bed, and dim the lighting to signal the end of cognitive input. By removing the visual trigger, you're weakening the neural pathway that leads to the habit. Over time, the craving dissipates because the loop isn't being reinforced. In the end, what you see is not just passive scenery, it's active instruction. Your visual environment is constantly teaching your brain what to do. The key is to curate that environment so that it aligns with who you want to become. Place the right cues in your line of sight. Make your goals visible. Let your space become an extension of your nervous system, because when your environment reflects your intentions, consistency becomes the natural path of least resistance. The autonomic nervous system, ANS, is often thought of as something that operates in the background, outside of our control, regulating heart rate, respiration, digestion, and even pupil dilation. And while it's true that these processes are largely involuntary, what's often overlooked is that the ANS is also highly adaptive. It doesn't just maintain balance in the body, it changes in response to what we do repeatedly. In other words, it learns, it reshapes its responsiveness based on experience, especially repeated experience. And when you force yourself to be consistent with a behavior, particularly one that challenges you physically or psychologically, you're training your autonomic system to meet that challenge more efficiently over time. Think of it this way: every time you engage in a challenging activity, whether it's cold exposure, endurance training, breath work, public speaking, or anything that increases stress, you're activating the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. This is the fight or flight response. Your heart rate increases, your pupils dilate, adrenaline and cortisol are released, and your body mobilizes energy to deal with the perceived threat or demand. This is a high arousal state, and in the beginning, it feels uncomfortable. The sympathetic system is doing its job, but it's working hard because the stimulus is unfamiliar. Your system is ramping up aggressively to meet the demand, but here's where repetition matters. When you expose yourself to the same stimulus consistently, the autonomic nervous system begins to recalibrate. It doesn't need to fire as intensely to handle the same challenge. You start to adapt. The heart rate doesn't spike as much, the breath stays steadier, and the mind remains clearer. This isn't just about becoming mentally tougher. This is a physiological tuning of your stress response. Your baseline shifts. You become more efficient. The same activity that once overwhelmed you now becomes manageable because your nervous system has learned what to expect and how to respond with greater precision and less effort. This is one of the key reasons why consistency is so powerful. You're not just building habits, you're building into resilience. And that resilience is not abstract, it's biologically real. The baroreceptors in your cardiovascular system, the chemoreceptors that monitor blood gases, and the mechanoreceptors in your muscles, all of them start feeding more efficient information to the brainstem and hypothalamus, which then fine-tune the autonomic response. Over time, your whole system becomes better at returning to balance after stress. This is called improved vagal tone, where the parasympathetic system, which promotes recovery, becomes more effective at shutting off the stress response once the task is done. That's why people who regularly train in high-stress environments, whether it's elite athletes, military personnel, or high-performing creatives, often seem calm in chaos. Their autonomic systems have been exposed to stress repeatedly and have learned not to overreact. Their heart rate variability increases, which is a biomarker of adaptability. Their breathing remains stable under pressure. They don't panic because their nervous system doesn't signal danger in the same way it once did. It's not that they don't feel stress, it's that they've adapted to it. This is also why routines and rituals are so valuable, not because they make life predictable, but because they train your physiology to associate certain cues with calm, focus, or energy. For example, if you meditate or do breath work at the same time every day, your body begins to anticipate it. The moment you enter that environment or posture, your autonomic system begins adjusting, lowering your heart rate, increasing parasympathetic activity, deepening your breath. This isn't magic, it's memory. The body remembers patterns. The more you embed those patterns through repetition, the more seamless the physiological shift becomes. But this works both ways. If you repeatedly respond to challenges by avoiding them, procrastinating, or overreacting, your autonomic system learns that pattern too. It becomes sensitized to stress. It begins to overfire, releasing more cortisol, triggering anxiety faster, taking longer to return to baseline. Over time, this creates a maladaptive stress response, where even small challenges feel overwhelming because the nervous system is not conditioned to handle them efficiently. So the question is not just, what are you doing consistently, but what is your nervous system learning from consistency? Because whether you're aware of it or not, you are training your autonomic system every day. The only difference is whether you're training it toward resilience or reactivity. Consistency, then, is not just about showing up, it's about repeatedly signaling to your body, This is safe. This is expected. We can handle this. The nervous system registers that signal and adjusts. Over weeks and months, your internal landscape becomes more stable, more robust. Stressful situations still occur, but they don't rattle you the same way. You're more centered, more capable, more adaptable. That's the biology of self-regulation, and it's built through repetition. In the end, consistency is less about effort and more about training. You're not just changing your mindset or your routine, you're retraining the very system that governs how you react to the world. And when that system is tuned, when it becomes efficient through repetition, you don't need to force calm or focus. You have become calm. You have become focused. Your body already knows what to do.